The afternoon sun bled through the tall windows of the bistro, casting long, amber shadows across the polished mahogany of table 4. Grace Miller moved with a practiced, liquid grace, her footsteps nearly silent against the plush carpet. She set the white porcelain cup down with a delicate click, the scent of vanilla and bergamot rising in a gentle cloud of steam. "Your favorite era?" Grace said, her voice dropping into that soft, melodic register she reserved only for this table. "Careful, it's still quite hot." Kong Era reached out, her slender fingers hovering for a moment before they found the handle with unerring precision. She didn't look at the cup. Her sightless eyes were fixed somewhere over Grace's shoulder, wide and clear, yet disconnected from the world of light. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. "I knew you were coming before you even spoke," Era whispered, her head tilting slightly. "You walk differently than the others, Grace. You don't stomp. You don't rush. You move like a breeze." Grace felt a familiar, cold prickle at the back of her neck. It wasn't the compliment that chilled her, but the truth behind it. She moved like a breeze because she had spent a decade learning how to move like a ghost. She didn't stomp because a heavy footstep in her previous life was a death sentence. "I just don't want to spill the tea, honey," Grace lied, the words tasting like ash. Era took a sip, the warmth bringing a faint flush to her cheeks. Outside the window, a black SUV slowed to a crawl, its tinted windows reflecting the street like obsidian. Grace's eyes tracked it instantly, her mind automatically registering the make, the model, and the slight dip in the suspension that suggested armor plating. She didn't blink. She didn't miss a beat as she straightened a stray napkin. "My father wants me to stay at the estate more," Era said suddenly, her voice dropping. "He says the city is becoming noisy, but I hate it there. It's too quiet. It feels like a tomb." She reached out, her hand finding Grace's forearm, her grip surprisingly firm. "I only feel truly safe when I'm here. When I hear your voice, it's like the world stops being scary. You're the only person who doesn't smell like fear or gunpowder." The irony was a physical weight in Grace's chest. She looked down at the girl's hand, so small, so trusting, resting on a limb that had snapped collarbones and ended lives in the dark. Grace was the very thing Era feared, a creature of the noisy world, hiding behind a white apron and a soft smile. "The world isn't so bad, Era," Grace said, her gaze shifting to the door as two men in heavy charcoal coats stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Grace gently patted Era's hand, her thumb brushing over the girl's pulse. It was steady, peaceful. Grace's own heart beat with the slow, rhythmic thump of a predator waiting for the tall grass to part. "I'll make sure nothing ruins your tea," Grace promised. It was the first honest thing she had said all day. She didn't stand. She coiled. Using the momentum of her trip, she lunged across the floor, driving the serrated steak knife she had palmed into the thigh of the second man. He gasped, his suppressed submachine gun swinging wildly, but Grace was already under his guard. She rose like a shadow, her elbow connecting with his jaw in a sickening crunch that sent him reeling into a nearby pillar. The third and fourth men raised their weapons, their eyes widening as they realized the easy obstacle was a ghost of the battlefield. Grace didn't give them the luxury of a clear shot. She seized a heavy wooden chair, swinging it with a strength that belied her slender frame, using it as a momentary shield and a blunt force weapon to break the line of fire. "Grace!" Era's voice was a thin thread of terror in the sudden silence of the struggle. "What's happening? I hear breaking." "Just clearing some clutter, Era," Grace replied. Her breath was steady, her pulse a cool, rhythmic beat. She stood between the girl and the remaining threats, the steak knife held in a reverse grip, her eyes cold and predatory. The waitress was gone. The specialist had returned to the light. The shift in the room was not a sound, but a sudden, suffocating change in pressure. Outside the bistro's floor-to-ceiling windows, the midday sun was abruptly eclipsed as three matte black SUVs swerved onto the curb, blocking the main entrance and the side exits with tactical precision. The screech of tires was the only warning before the world outside turned into a wall of tinted glass and steel, Inside, the hum of polite conversation died instantly. The floor manager dropped a stack of menus, the heavy paper fluttering to the floor like wounded birds, while a junior waiter froze mid-step, his face draining of all color as he stared at the perimeter being established outside. Panic began to ripple through the dining room. A low, frantic murmur of diners reaching for phones and pushing back chairs. Grace Miller did not move. Her hands remained steady as she cleared a stray sugar packet from table 4. While the rest of the staff descended into a disorganized blur of motion, Grace's world narrowed into a sharp, crystalline focus. She didn't need to look at the SUVs to know they were armored, or to know that the men spilling out of them were moving in a pincer formation. Grace. Era's voice was small, vibrating with the sudden spike of tension she couldn't see but could certainly feel. The air, it went cold. Why did everyone stop talking? Grace leaned in, her body positioning itself instinctively between Era and the front door, creating a human shield so subtle the girl wouldn't even realize she was being protected. Just a bit of traffic outside, Era, Grace said. Her voice remained an impossible anchor of calm. Smooth, soft, and entirely devoid of the adrenaline currently flooding the room. The manager is just a little stressed today. Stay exactly where you are. Your tea is still warm. Through the glass, Grace watched the lead man reach into his charcoal overcoat. She recognized the silhouette of a suppressed submachine gun before it even cleared the fabric. Behind her, a waitress let out a muffled sob of terror, but Grace's heartbeat didn't accelerate. It slowed. This was the sharp world she had tried to leave behind, bleeding into the soft world she had tried to build. The locks on the front doors clicked. The bistro staff began to retreat toward the kitchen in a frantic scramble. But Grace stood her ground at table 4, her fingers curling around the heavy, serrated edge of a steak knife she had just palmed from a nearby setting. "Grace, your hand," Era whispered, reaching out into the air. "You're so still. You feel like stone." "I'm right here, Era," Grace replied. Her eyes locked on the door as the first shadow fell across the threshold. "I'm not going anywhere." The front door of the bistro hissed open, admitting a gust of street noise that was quickly silenced by the heavy click of the lock engaging behind the intruders. 4 men in charcoal coats fanned out, their movements synchronized and predatory. The lead hitman, a man with a jagged scar across his temple, focused his gaze entirely on Era, ignoring the cowering staff and the panicked diners diving beneath their tables. He moved with the arrogance of a man who believed he was walking into a room full of sheep. Grace didn't look up as he approached table 4. She remained leaned over, as if whispered, comforting a frightened child. "Keep your head down, Era. We're playing a game of statues," she murmured, her voice a calm melody amidst the rising discord. As the lead man drew level with her, Grace shifted. It looked like a stumble, a clumsy, frightened waitress losing her footing in the chaos. Her hip bumped the edge of the table, and her foot hooked sharply behind the man's lead ankle. The movement was so fluid, so seemingly accidental, that the hitman had no time to compensate. He pitched forward, his professional poise shattering as gravity took hold. The moment his chest hit the floor, the waitress vanished. Grace's hand shot out, her fingers closing around the heavy porcelain teapot she had just served. In one continuous motion, she brought it down with clinical force against the back of the falling man's skull. The ceramic shattered, a spray of vanilla-scented steam and white shards exploding across the carpet as he went limp. Before his companions could process the sound, Grace was already in motion. The remaining hitmen recovered from their initial shock, their weapons tracking Grace with frantic, jerky movements. Grace didn't wait for them to find their rhythm. With a single, explosive kick, she sent a heavy serving cart crashing into a decorative pillar near the open kitchen pass. The impact shattered a row of industrial-sized carafes, sending a plume of pressurized steam and white mist billowing into the dining area. Within seconds, the bistro was transformed into a landscape of gray ghosts. To the gunman, the world had become an impenetrable fog. To Grace, it was a tactical advantage she had exploited 100 times in the field. She moved back to table 4 before the mist could even settle. Era was trembling, her sightless eyes darting toward the sounds of heavy boots and clicking safeties. Grace reached out, but she didn't grab the girl's hand. Instead, she took the noise-canceling headphones Era used for her audiobooks from the back of the chair and slid them over the girl's ears. She turned the volume up on a soft, rhythmic cello piece, effectively sealing Era away in a world of melodic peace. "Stay in the music, Era," Grace whispered, though she knew the girl couldn't hear her. She pressed a final, reassuring hand to Era's shoulder before vanishing back into the haze. The third hitman fired blindly into the steam. The suppressed thud-thud-thud of his weapon was a dull heartbeat in the muffled room. Grace didn't flinch. She used the sound to pinpoint his location, gliding through the white veil like a predator in her natural habitat. She appeared beside him not as a woman, but as a silent consequence. She seized the hot barrel of his gun with a thick linen napkin, wrenching it upward while delivering a devastating knee to his solar plexus. He folded without a sound, his consciousness claimed by the dark before he even hit the floor. The final man panicked, his goggles fogging up in the humidity of the bistro. He spun in a circle, his finger white-knuckled on the trigger. Grace didn't give him the chance to spray the room. She emerged from the steam directly behind him, her movements mirrored by the absolute silence of the girl at table 4, who sat serenely enveloped in her music. Grace reached out, her hands moving with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon. A sharp twist, a muffled choke, and the final threat was neutralized. As the industrial vents began to suck the steam from the air, Grace stood in the center of the carnage, her breath steady and her eyes devoid of heat. She looked back at Era, who was swaying slightly to a song only she could hear, completely unaware that the soft world had been bought with a silent, bloody price. The industrial vents hummed, gradually pulling the last of the white steam into the ceiling and revealing the wreckage of the bistro. The once elegant dining room was now a graveyard of shattered porcelain and crumpled forms in charcoal coats. Silence rushed back into the space, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the faint, tinny leak of cello music from Era's headphones. Grace Miller stood in the center of the carnage. Her white apron was no longer pristine. A spray of crimson had blossomed across the fabric like a macabre work of art, and a thin trail of blood ran down her knuckles, dripping onto the carpet with a soft, rhythmic thud. Her chest rose and fell in slow, controlled cycles. She looked at her hands, the hands of a specialist, and felt the familiar, cold hollow opening up in her chest. The monster had been summoned, and it didn't want to go back into the dark. She turned toward table 4. Era sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted as she drifted through the music Grace had used to cage her. To anyone else, the scene was a nightmare. To Era, it was just another moment of waiting for her friend. Grace took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the predatory tension out of her shoulders. She reached out and gently slid the headphones down around Era's neck. "The clutter is all cleared away, honey," Grace said. Her voice was a miracle of deception. It was the same soft, melodic waitress voice, warm, inviting, and entirely steady. There was no tremor of adrenaline, no hint of the violence she had just orchestrated. Era turned her sightless eyes toward the sound, a look of profound relief washing over her face. "It's so quiet now. Even the air feels different. Did everyone leave?" "The lunch rush is over," Grace replied, stepping closer. She carefully kept her bloodied hands behind her back, though she knew the girl couldn't see them. "The manager decided to close early today. It's just us." Era reached out, her fingers searching the air. "Grace, you sound peaceful, but I smell something, like old pennies and copper." Grace froze. She had forgotten how sharp Era's other senses were. The metallic tang of fresh blood was thick in the humid air, an unmistakable scent to those who knew it. "Just a little spill in the kitchen, Era," Grace lied, her heart finally giving a heavy, mournful tug. One of the chefs dropped a tray of silverware. "I'll get you home now. Your father's car should be right outside." As Grace guided the girl toward the door, stepping over a limp arm without a second glance, she realized the soft world hadn't just been punctured. It had been obliterated. She could use her voice to lie, but she couldn't wash the scent of the specialist off her soul. The front doors of the bistro didn't just open. They were overtaken. The silence Grace had meticulously built was shattered by the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots. A dozen men in sharp, charcoal suits flooded the foyer, but they weren't the disorganized hitmen Grace had just dismantled. These were the inner circle, the elite guard of the Kong Empire, and they moved with the grim efficiency of men arriving at a massacre that in the center of the storm walked Kong Tae-suk. He didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, glacial calm, his presence sucking the remaining oxygen out of the room. His eyes, cold and obsidian, swept over the wreckage of the dining room, the shattered porcelain, the rising steam, and the 4 professional killers crumpled like discarded rags. His gaze paused on the man with the scarred temple, a rival family's high-level enforcer, now lying motionless near the dessert cart. Finally, his eyes landed on Grace. She was still standing by table 4, her hand resting lightly on Era's shoulder. She had draped her clean sweater over her blood-spattered apron, but she couldn't hide the predatory stillness in her posture or the slow, rhythmic drip of blood from her knuckles. She looked less like a waitress and more like a statue carved from graveyard marble. "Father." Era's voice was a small, trembling bird in the vacuum of the room. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air until Tae-suk stepped forward, his expression shifting from cold fury to a pained, intense devotion. He caught her hand, his thumb stroking her palm with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who commanded a city of ghosts. "I'm here, Era. I'm right here." He pulled his daughter into a brief, tight embrace, his eyes never leaving Grace. Over Era's shoulder, the Mafia Don studied the waitress. He saw the way her feet were planted, ready to spring. He saw the steak knife still gripped in a reverse hold behind her back. He saw the lack of fear in her eyes, replaced instead by a weary, professional recognition. He had expected to arrive at a funeral. Instead, he had found a miracle protected by a monster. "You," Tae-suk said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the quiet bistro. "You did this." Grace didn't blink. She didn't lower her guard. "The tea was getting cold," she replied, her waitress voice returning, though the sweetness was gone, replaced by a jagged, steel-edged. Tae-suk looked at the pile of dead professionals, then back at the woman in the stained apron. A slow, dark realization dawned on his face. He didn't see a server anymore. He saw a weapon that had been hidden in plain sight, a ghost that had chosen to haunt his enemies to save his child. "Who are you?" he demanded, the question hanging in the air like a threat. Grace looked at Era, then back at the man who owned the city. "I'm the person who kept her alive," she said quietly. "That's all you need to know." The private office at the back of the Kong estate was a tomb of glass and shadows. Rain drummed a frantic rhythm against the windows, but inside, the air was unnervingly still. Kong Tae-suk sat behind a desk of black obsidian, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a laptop screen. Across from him, Grace Miller sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had washed the blood from her skin, but the scent of iron seemed to cling to her pores like a second skin. Tae-suk turned the screen toward her. It showed a series of high-level database queries, Interpol, the CIA, even the deep web archives of the Underworld. Every search bar returned the same 2 words: no record. "I've spent the last hour reaching out to people who specialize in knowing things that don't exist," Tae-suk said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They tell me you are a ghost. No birth certificate, no tax returns, no fingerprints on file. Even the bistro's hiring records for Grace Miller were backdated by a professional." Grace didn't flinch. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. "Maybe I'm just a very boring person, Mr. Kong." Tae-suk leaned forward, his hands interlaced. "Boring people don't use a pressure point strike to collapse a man's windpipe in 3 seconds. Boring people don't move through a tactical pincer formation like they're walking through a park. I know what a ghost is. You're a specialist. An eraser, a shadow, a tool used by governments when they want a problem to disappear without leaving a signature." He stood up, walking to the window to watch the guards patrolling the perimeter. My daughter thinks you are a saint. She told me you have the kindest soul she's ever felt. But I saw you in that bistro. I saw the way you looked at those men. You weren't afraid. You were bored." He turned back, his eyes burning with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Who did you work for? Was it the agency? Or were you one of the disappearances from the 707th Special Missions Group?" "Does it matter?" Grace asked quietly. "The woman you're looking for is dead. She's been dead for 3 years. The woman who serves your daughter tea is the only one left." "The woman who serves my daughter tea is a target," Tae-suk countered, slamming his palm onto the desk. "You've exposed yourself. The Syndicate will come for you now, and they will go through Era to get to you. I don't care about your past, Grace. I care about my daughter's future. I need to know if you are a threat to her, or if you are the only thing capable of keeping her heart beating." Grace met his gaze, and for the first time, the waitress mask fell away entirely. Her eyes went flat and cold, reflecting a darkness that made even the Mafia Don hesitate. "If I were a threat to her, Mr. Kong, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You would have stopped breathing the moment you entered that bistro." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Tae-suk didn't call for his guards. Instead, he sat back down, a grim, respect-filled smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had his answer. The peace of the Kong estate was shattered not by a bang, but by a sudden, jarring silence. The rhythmic hum of the ventilation system cut out, and the security lights pulsing in the hallway flickered once before dying into an oppressive, velvet black. In the nursery, Grace was on her feet before the first emergency generator could even cough to life. She didn't reach for a light. She reached for Era. "Grace." Era's voice was a whisper of pure instinct. She didn't sound frightened yet, just confused. The music stopped. "And the house? It feels heavy." "Don't move," Grace commanded. The soft, melodic waitress was gone, replaced by the clipped, tonal precision of a commander. Outside the heavy oak doors, the muffled thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire began to chew through the silence of the mansion. Shouts followed, short, wet gasps of men dying in the dark. Tae-suk's elite guards were being dismantled. This wasn't a hit squad. It was an invasion. Grace swept Era out of bed, her movements a blur of calculated efficiency. She didn't wait for the door to be kicked in. She knew the layout of the estate from the mental map she'd built during her interrogation. She pulled Era into the walk-in closet, sliding a hidden panel behind a row of silk dresses, a priest's hole Tae-suk likely thought only he knew about. "Listen to me, Era. We are going to play a game. You remember the breeze?" Grace whispered, her lips ghosting against the girl's ear. "I need you to be the breeze. No sound, no crying. Just hold onto my neck and don't let go. No matter what you hear." Grace palmed a suppressed pistol from a hidden magnetic mount beneath the closet shelf, a gift she'd liberated from a guard earlier that evening. She checked the chamber by touch alone. They moved through the service vents, the air thick with the smell of dust and cold copper. Below them, the mansion was a war zone. Grace could hear the heavy boots of the Syndicate's cleaners moving through the rooms, the cold efficiency of their sweep indicating they weren't just looking for Tae-suk. They were looking for the girl. A floorboard creaked above them. Grace froze, her body tensed like a coiled spring, her arm forming a cradle of iron around Era. Through a narrow vent slat, she saw the sweep of a tactical light. The beam danced inches from Era's terrified face. Grace's finger tightened on the trigger, her breath held. Her heart rate dropped to a glacial 40 beats per minute. The light passed. The footsteps receded. "They're gone," Era breathed, her voice trembling. "Grace, you're shaking." "I'm not shaking, Era," Grace said, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "I'm accelerating." She knew the exits were burned. The only way out was through the courtyard, a killing field. Grace looked at the girl who thought she was a saint and realized the blood pact was sealed. To get Era to the gate, she would have to turn the estate into a slaughterhouse. The rain had stopped, leaving the estate draped in a heavy, bruised mist. Grace stood in the center of the marble foyer, the silence finally absolute. The Syndicate's reach had been severed at the wrist, but the cost was etched into the scorched walls and the cold weight of the weapon in her hand. She looked down at her reflection in a shattered floor-to-ceiling mirror. Her waitress uniform was a rag of stained linen and soot, a costume for a woman who no longer existed. Slowly, Grace untied the strings of her white apron. She let it fall to the bloodied floor, a ghost of the quiet life she had tried to steal. Grace. Era stood by the doorway, her hand tracing the frame for stability. She was dressed in a simple traveling coat, her face pale but remarkably calm. She didn't ask about the bodies that had been cleared away or the smell of cordite that lingered in the vents. She simply turned her head toward the sound of Grace's breathing. "It's time to go, Era," Grace said. The voice was different now. It still held the warmth the girl loved, but the waitress lilt was gone, replaced by the steady, unshakable resonance of a protector. Grace stepped into the dressing room where a new attire waited. It was a tailored tactical suit, charcoal gray and reinforced with liquid armor, designed to move as silently as a second skin. As she cinched the belt and checked the concealed holsters, she felt the final pieces of her old self click into place. She wasn't a waitress pretending to be a soldier, and she wasn't a soldier pretending to be a waitress. She was something new. She was the shield. She emerged to find Kang Tae-suk waiting by the armored transport. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the ghost fully realized. He offered no contract, no more threats. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of grim, absolute trust. He knew that from this moment on, his daughter's life didn't belong to his empire. It belonged to the woman in the shadows. Grace reached for Era's hand, her gloved fingers interlacing with the girl's small, warm ones. "Where are we going?" Era asked as they stepped into the cool night air. "Somewhere safe," Grace replied, guiding her into the back of the car. "I'm going to be with you every step of the way, Era. You might not see me, but I'll never be more than a heartbeat away." As the gates of the estate hissed shut behind them, Grace Miller looked out at the city lights. She had traded her anonymity for a different kind of prison. But as Era leaned her head against Grace's shoulder and drifted into a safe, untroubled sleep, Grace knew the trade was worth it. She was no longer running from her nature. She was using it to keep the only light she had left from ever going dark.